Truckee, California, where storms can swallow mountains whole. On one such night, a child vanished into the white, chasing a hope stronger than fear. The police had minutes, maybe less. Their answer came on Four Paws Ranger, a German shepherd, trained to find the lost. But what they uncovered was more than a rescue. It was a testimony of love breaking chains of neglect. If this story moves you, show your support. Like, subscribe, and comment. Amen for every child waiting for kindness. The kitchen of the rental on Maple Street wore its age like a faded uniform, scuffed linoleum. A rattling vent over the stove, a window that frosted along the edges, even though October hadn't yet surrendered to snow. Railroad horns drifted from the west side of town, where freight crept through evenings, and the neighbor's flag lifted and fell in the breeze like a slow breath. Ethan Cole, 5 years old and careful as a field mouse, lined up carrot sticks along the rim of a white plate chipped to the brown. He did things quietly because quiet was the one thing that never drew fire. His tin sheriff's star, handed to him at a small county fair by his mother, the summer before she got sick, glinted on the table, the kind of cheap souvenir that bends if you press too hard. Cheap or not, it was the one thing that felt like a steady hand on his back, a promise pressed into metal. Across from him, Brenda Cole stirred a pot of pasta sauce like it had wronged her. The TV in the living room muttered sports highlights, the volume low. A game the night before had gone into extra innings and the replay refused to quit. The room smelled of tomato and something burned beneath it, a stubborn undertone neither scrubbing nor complaining could lift. Brenda wore an old sweatshirt with the sleeves shoved to the elbows and a rubber band digging into her ponytail. She wasn't loud. She didn't have to be. She had a way of setting the room on edge with just a glance, and her glances were cheap, frequent, and sharp. Mark Cole came through the door with his lunch pail at the same time the freight horn moaned long. He was a drywall finisher with white dust caught like frost in the seams of his jacket and under his nails. He kissed the air near Brenda's cheek, said something about invoices, then rubbed his hands together the way a man does when the sink runs cold, but his bones feel colder. He looked at Ethan and smiled halfway, as if his face had learned the motion once and now forgot how to complete it. Ethan slid the sheriff's star close to his plate so it wouldn't get lost, but so he could touch it with one fingertip whenever the room tilted. "Wash your hands," Brenda said without looking. Ethan obeyed. He liked the smell of the lemon soap because it meant there was an order to things wet, rub, rinse, dry. The towel had little blue checks that matched almost nothing in the house. He dried careful and returned to his chair without scraping it. He had learned to lift before he moved. The sauce splashed on the burner and the hiss sounded like a snake that had been waiting under the stove all day. Brenda snapped the wooden spoon upright in the pot, wiped her hands, and picked up the tin star between two fingers the way she might lift a dead fly by one wing. "You left this out," she said, not really asking. "I was showing it the train," Ethan said, and heard the words as they fell too earnest, too quick. He felt how they landed wrong, saw it in the way Brenda's eyes thinned. "It's junk," she said, and bent the cheap metal a little as if proving a point. Ethan felt the room tilt. He extended his hand, not daring to snatch. "Please," he said, and the word sounded like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. She considered the star that nothing trinket, then the boy with his small open hand. "You leave your clutter everywhere," she said, and reached for the trash can under the sink. Ethan rose a fraction in his chair, not enough to scrape. The chair's front legs hovered. Mark stood with his thermos against his chest. The thermos had dents that told stories about ladders and long days, and the way a man promises to come home by coming home. He watched Brenda's hand over the trash can and set the thermos on the table with a hollow clank. The sound could have been decision. It wasn't. "Let him keep it," he said, quiet enough to sound like weather rather than weather warning. Brenda's mouth ticked not up, not down. Then he can learn to put it away, she answered and pivoted to the sink instead, rinsing the star under the tap before setting it on the counter. Water shining like mercy for 1 second, and then drying into nothing. Ethan eased back into his chair, the legs settling without a whisper. He pulled the star toward him with 2 fingers and breathed a thank you he did not dare shape into a sound. Mark glanced at him and then at his own hands rough as the underside of a porch. Dinner happened in tiny noises, the click of forks, the squeak of the vent, the page flip of a coupon book Brenda kept by the mixer, because she liked to know the price of things even when she couldn't change them. The quiet wasn't restful. It was the kind of quiet that holds a mirror and asks what you're going to do with yourself. Ethan chewed and counted to 5 between bites because someone at church once said 5 was a handful of grace. He didn't remember the sermon, just the way the church smelled like old books and coffee and a poster with a shepherd carrying a lamb that made him feel both foolish and seen. When a noodle slid off his fork and left a wet stripe on the placemat, Brenda's head turned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Slow down," she said, and the words had edges. Ethan blotted the sauce with the corner of his napkin so expertly you could tell he'd practiced. Mark swallowed. "I'll take him to the yard after," he said, like proposing a treaty. "We can toss a ball." Brenda took a long sip of water and stared at the condensation sliding down the glass as if it were a measurement he'd failed. "He's got bath and reading tonight," she said, "if you're not too tired." The small slash of a smile that wasn't one tugged her mouth before she stood to fetch more napkins. Mark nodded at his plate at the table at some middle distance where men put their pride so no one trips over it. Sure, he said, and he meant it, and did not all at once. After dishes, Ethan placed the star in the blue plastic bin under his bed, where he kept other treasures, a stubby pencil with a football on the eraser, a postcard with a lighthouse from a gas station rack, a sticker he'd never peeled because it seemed wrong to make something permanent when the world refused to be. The bin slid home with a soft click. He paused on the carpet and listened to the house talk to itself, the furnace like an old dog shifting the TV now turned up because the news had moved on to weather the neighbor's lawn sprinkler ticking out of rhythm with its own shadow. Brenda passed his doorway carrying laundry, the smell of dryer sheets a little too sweet and somehow thin. She stopped, leaned against the frame, and studied him like a teacher who doesn't love her work. "Tomorrow," she said, "you're going to start putting your shoes by the mat. Not wherever you take them off." Ethan nodded, hands at his sides, and felt the invisible chalk line on the floor here, safe there not. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "And put that star on top of the dresser if it means so much to you. I'm not picking it up again." He nodded again, and when she left, he took the star from the bin, wiped it dry with the edge of his shirt, and set it on the dresser where the late sun could catch its cheap shine and make it into more than it was. Mark appeared behind him in the glass. He was a tall reflection with slump at the edges, a man with a good jaw and bad sleep. "How about a story?" he asked, and the question sat in the room like a guest who doesn't know whether to take off his shoes. "About trains," Ethan said. Mark smiled the whole way this time. "About trains," he said, and sat on the edge of the bed. He talked about boxcars and couplers and how sometimes a conductor walks the length of a train in weather that slices your coat. He made the horn with his mouth not loud, and the sound was almost silly. Ethan laughed short and surprised like a bird noticing its own song. Then the phone buzzed in Brenda's pocket down the hall. She answered in a tone that killed the end of a sentence Mark hadn't finished. He looked at the doorway, the hall light his boots by the wall. He looked back at Ethan and smoothed the blanket in short strokes. "I've got to help your stepmom with some bills," he said. He made it sound important because if it was important, then leaving wouldn't be the same thing as leaving. "Okay," Ethan said and tucked his knees. He pinched the corner of the star and turned it a fraction so it faced the door as if it could keep watch while he slept. Mark stood and left his steps soft like a man who knows where the creaks are. In the living room, the voices thinned, then thickened, then fell into a long silence that meant reconciliation or defeat, he couldn't tell which. The house cooled as night came on. Traffic dipped. The sprinkler stuttered to a stop. A siren somewhere far off rose and faded, not dramatic, just part of the town's background music. Ethan watched the square of streetlight crawl up the wall as a car passed and thought of the train horn he loved and of a real sheriff's badge, heavy and honest. He didn't know either would ever belong to him. He only knew that the small star on the dresser looked like it might tell a grown-up what to do if only the grown-up would listen. In the doorway, Mark paused, listening to a lull that felt too thin to be peace. He could go back in and tell a second story, make two horns, with his mouth risk being late to another kind of duty. He pressed his thumb against the doorframe where paint had layered in years like growth rings. He lowered his hand. He went to the couch. Ethan watched the shadows slow and for the third time that week decided to be good enough to earn morning. The week slid forward in small gray increments each day, marked by the scrape of Mark's boots at dawn, Brenda's clipped voice in the kitchen, and Ethan's quiet counting of steps across the carpet to keep the floor from becoming too loud. By Friday evening, the town had folded itself into the kind of autumn chill that sneaks into bones, the kind that makes porch lights burn brighter against a deepening dusk. Ethan sat cross-legged near the window of his bedroom, his sheriff's star balanced on one knee and a small crayon drawing on the other. The paper showed a crooked house, a tall tree, and a smiling stick figure holding hands with a dog larger than both. He had pressed hard with the blue crayon, so the sky looked more like ocean waves than air. He wanted to show it to Mark when he came home, but the sound of Brenda moving in the hallway slowed his courage. She carried a basket of laundry into the living room and paused when she saw the drawing lying on the table. She picked it up, held it at arm's length, and frowned as if the paper had betrayed her with its smudges. "What is this mess doing here?" she asked, her tone more tired than sharp, but to Ethan it felt like a verdict. He hurried from the hall and tried to explain, saying it was his drawing that he wanted to surprise his dad, but his words collided and fell apart. Brenda shook her head, set the basket down, and told him sternly that the table was not for clutter, that paper and crayons belonged in a box, not scattered where someone might spill water. She pressed the drawing against his chest, and though she did not tear it, her gesture folded one edge and left a crease running across the blue sky. Ethan nodded quickly, murmured an apology, and scurried back to his room, the paper pressed flat with his small hands as if he could iron away the damage with the warmth of his palms. He laid it on the floor and smoothed it again and again until the crease faded, but never truly disappeared. The house beyond his window was full of ordinary sounds, the whir of the dryer, the low murmur of Mark talking with Brenda about bills, the clatter of dishes stacked for the morning. Yet each sound felt like a wall rather than a comfort. Ethan slid the star into his pocket, tucked the drawing under his pillow, and pulled the blanket up, though it was not yet bedtime. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the figure in the drawing stepping down from the page, the dog's ears pricking the sky smooth and uncreased. He whispered to the pillow, "Maybe out there," and let the thought stretch like a bridge to a place he could not name. Later that night, Mark came home later than usual, his face lined deeper than the morning, his steps heavier. He peeked into Ethan's room and found the boy curled tightly, his hand gripping the corner of the pillow as if holding the whole world steady. Mark considered waking him, telling him about trains again, but the weight of the week dragged him to the couch where he fell asleep with the television muttering late news. The window in Ethan's room caught the glow of the porch light painting a pale square across the wall. The air inside had grown cold because Brenda preferred not to waste money on heat before winter truly settled. Ethan's socks were thin and his toes curled tight. He stared at the square of light and thought of doors that opened instead of closing. Near midnight, after the house had grown silent except for the furnace's occasional groan, Ethan slid carefully from his bed. He wore his flannel pajamas under a patched jacket and pulled on 2 mismatched mittens he had found at the bottom of a drawer. His shoes were by the mat as Brenda had instructed, and he slipped them on without a sound. He opened the dresser drawer, slowly, took the star and pinned it crookedly to his jacket. Then he stood at the threshold of his room listening. Mark snored faintly from the couch. Brenda's breathing came even from the bedroom, and no one stirred as Ethan opened the front door a fraction at a time. The night air rushed in colder than he expected with the smell of pine needles and the faint echo of the highway. Ethan stepped onto the porch, clutching the railing with small hands as if to steady the entire night. The porch light haloed him in gold, and beyond that glow, the yard lay hushed, the grass stiff with frost. He hesitated, his breath puffing like smoke, then whispered to himself, "Out there, someone kind." He took one step, then another, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt final, but not frightening. He walked past the fence where frost traced the wood down the narrow sidewalk that led toward the street, each step leaving a small print that shimmered faintly in the light. The world beyond the yard was darker, quieter, but to Ethan it seemed to call as if the houses themselves were waiting to unfold some gentler story. He followed the sound of the distant train, the horn long and low like a voice calling his name across the valley. He did not walk quickly. His legs were small and the air pressed heavy, but he believed each step was carrying him closer to the smile he had drawn on the paper, the one that did not crease. The town was asleep, windows dim lampposts standing as silent guardians. A dog barked once from a far yard, then fell quiet. Ethan paused, listening, imagining that bark belonged to the great dog from his drawing. He whispered again, "I'll find you," and continued. Back at the house, the porch light glowed over empty steps. Inside, Mark shifted in his sleep, unaware, and Brenda stirred once, pulling the blanket closer. The night pressed on clear and cold, the kind of night when a child's footprints can vanish before morning. The street stretched quiet beneath the pale glow of scattered lamps, and Ethan's small shoes crunched softly on the frozen sidewalk as he moved farther from the porch light of his home. The jacket he wore sagged at the elbows, the mittens hung loose on his fingers, but his steps carried determination, not panic. He looked at the breath rising in front of his face, and thought of it as smoke from a train engine, steady puffs guiding him forward. The neighborhood lay hushed, blinds, drawn cars lined in tidy rows, their windshields glimmering with thin frost. As he reached the end of the block, a breeze lifted from the ridge and sent a shiver through the trees, scattering dry needles across the pavement. To Ethan, the sound was not frightening. It was like a whisper urging him along. He turned toward the road that led toward the hills and tucked his star close against his jacket as if it could warm him. Above him, the sky thickened clouds gathering from the mountains. The air carried the faint bite of snow, though it was not yet falling. Ethan walked slowly, sometimes dragging one shoe through the frost to watch the line appear behind him, a line that felt like proof he was leaving a trail for someone kind to find. When a gust swirled stronger and scattered flakes from the dark, he lifted his face and smiled. He did not see the storm as threat, but as a signpost, a curtain that opened the path toward the gentler world he imagined. Each flake melted quickly on his cheeks, but he thought of them as small lights dropped from the sky to show him where to step. At the corner near a grocery store that had closed hours earlier, the parking lot shone wide and empty, its lamps buzzing faintly. A man in a delivery van rolled across the lot, slowed for a moment when his headlights caught a small figure at the edge of the road. He squinted, thought it must be a neighbor's child testing the cold, maybe waiting for a parent to call him back inside. The man adjusted his cap, muttered about the weather turning rough, and drove on without stopping. The taillights glowed red for a moment, then vanished into the bend, leaving Ethan again alone with the crunch of his steps and the slow swirl of snow beginning to fall heavier. The boy did not hurry. His pace matched the quiet of the night, his small shoulders squared against the wind. The star glimmered faintly each time he passed beneath a lamp. He imagined the houses watching him, their windows like half-closed eyes, and he whispered softly, "I'm going to find the kind people." The words escaped into the storm and disappeared, but to him it was enough that they had been spoken aloud. Snow thickened as he reached the outer edge of town where the road narrowed toward the ridge. Pines leaned in from both sides, their branches catching white in sudden weight. The ground shifted from pavement to patches of gravel, and Ethan stepped carefully, lifting his shoes higher when the drifts grew. He stopped once to press his mitten against a trunk, leaving a faint mark as if signing his name. The cold seeped through his coat, but he clutched the star and thought of it as a shield. In the distance, the train horn rose again, longer this time, muffled by snow but steady. The sound filled him with both urgency and comfort. He believed it was waiting that the train and the people on it might be the ones who would smile at him the way he had drawn on paper. He quickened for a few steps, then slowed again, conserving what little strength his legs held. Back in the neighborhood, the porch light of the coal house still glowed, but no one had yet noticed the absence behind Ethan's closed door. Brenda's voice was low-tangled in talk of bills, and Mark shifted on the couch, turning once in restless half-sleep. The night outside moved on without them carrying the boy farther into the hush, as the snow deepened and the lamps grew fewer. Ethan tilted his head to watch flakes whirl in the beam of one last light before the road curved into darker pines. He whispered to himself that the storm was showing him the way that the world was kind enough to send falling stars down as his guide. With that thought, he pressed on, leaving a fragile trail of prints already half erased by the weather. At dawn, the storm still clung to the Sierra foothills, leaving drifts along fences and glassy patches on the county road. Houses in the small neighborhood stirred slowly awake smoke curling from chimneys, lights flicking on as people brewed coffee against the cold. On the corner of Pine and Willow, an older woman named Mrs. Gardner opened her front door to fetch the paper and noticed a thin trail of footprints wandering past her yard. They were too small for any grown man, uneven as if the walker had struggled against the storm. She bent down, touched the print with her gloved hand, and felt a chill deeper than the morning frost. She knew every child on the block, and none should have been out in that weather. She called the Truckee Police Department without hesitation, her voice trembling as she explained the odd discovery. The call reached Officer Jack Miller just as he parked his patrol SUV outside the station. Jack was a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, calm by habit, his uniform crisp even after long nights. In the back compartment of his vehicle, Ranger, his German Shepherd partner, stirred at the sound of the radio crackle. Jack lifted the handset and responded. "Copy footprints, small size, direction unknown." "I'll take it." He turned toward the kennel and unlocked the gate. Ranger leapt down landing with a soft thud on the packed snow, his amber eyes alert. Jack crouched and clipped the tracking harness, tightening the strap beneath the dog's chest. "Looks like we're on duty, partner," he said softly, and Ranger wagged his tail once as if confirming. By the time Jack reached the neighborhood, Mrs. Gardner was waiting on her porch in a heavy coat, pointing toward the narrow trail that led away from the homes and toward the ridge. Jack parked, scanned the prints, and felt the weight of the situation press in. The tracks were fresh, but already filling with snow. A child alone in this weather could not last long. He radioed dispatch, requested backup, and began the search with Ranger leading. The dog lowered his nose, sniffing the edges of each print, then surged forward with purpose. Jack adjusted his stride to keep up, boots crunching in rhythm with Ranger's paws. The trail wound past a chain-link fence, across a shallow ditch, and into the first line of trees. Jack noted the small size of the steps, the uneven pattern, and the way the tracks drifted toward the slope. He murmured encouragement to Ranger, though the dog needed none. Ranger's ears flicked forward, his body tense with focus. Each tug of the harness told Jack the child was near enough for scent to cling despite the storm. As they climbed, the snow deepened, swallowing Ranger's paws up to the ankles. Jack pushed forward, shining his flashlight, even though daylight was breaking because the woods held shadows darker than the hour. Ranger suddenly stopped. Head lifting, ears pricked. He gave a low whine, a signal Jack knew well the trail was not only live, but urgent. Jack scanned the terrain and saw the direction of the prints veering toward a steep incline where rocks jutted beneath thin snow. His stomach tightened. A 5-year-old could easily vanish into the ravine below. He called it in steady voice, masking the unease. Unit 7 confirmed child-sized prints heading northwest toward ridgeline terrain hazardous. Request EMS standby. The dispatcher acknowledged, tone clipped but calm. Jack reached down, rubbed Ranger's neck once for reassurance, then gave the command. Find him. Ranger surged again, pulling hard, guiding his handler toward the incline. Jack's breath came heavy in the thin air, but he pushed without hesitation. Behind them, the town seemed far away, rooftops shrinking, the noise of traffic muted by snow. Ahead, the ridge loomed, wind slicing through the pines, carrying the faint cry of a train far off. Ranger paused once more, sniffed the air, then barked once sharp and low. Jack followed his gaze and saw fresh scuffs on the snow, evidence the child had stumbled but kept going. He felt a rush of urgency, the kind that pressed memories of other searches into his mind, searches that had ended too late. He tightened his grip on the leash and whispered, "We'll get him, partner. Keep steady." The dog lowered his head and pressed on tail-stiff muscles, taut with instinct. Jack's eyes tracked the prints carefully, noting how they wavered, how the right foot dragged slightly as if exhaustion had begun to weigh. He pictured a small figure out there in the cold, clutching something close, eyes searching for kindness. He felt the responsibility settle deeper in his chest. The trail climbed higher, the snow swirling harder, erasing the back edges as quickly as they were made. Jack knew time was closing. He leaned into the slope boots, slipping once, catching himself on a branch. Ranger pulled with renewed urgency, and Jack followed flashlight beam cutting across the storm. The path bent toward a line of cedars that shielded the ridge. The dog's bark broke again, louder this time, echoing against the trees. Jack radioed once more, voice firm. "We have live sign. Continuing pursuit." He pressed forward, his partner leading both of them, aware without words that every second mattered, that a child's life depended on their pace. The ridge wind sharpened as Officer Jack Miller pressed higher, with Ranger tugging against the harness, but each step grew harder because the snowfall thickened into a curtain that erased the ground behind them and swallowed the faint tracks ahead. The small boot prints Ethan had left only minutes earlier blurred into shallow impressions, then vanished completely under the drift. Jack stopped for a moment, swept his flashlight across the white sheet, and muttered encouragement to the shepherd at his side. Ranger sniffed frantically along the slope, circling twice tail rigid. Jack's jaw tightened, because he knew how quickly a trail could die in weather like this. He crouched low, brushed his gloved hand over the snow, and whispered, "Come on, boy. Find something." Ranger suddenly dropped his muzzle, pawed at a drift, and pulled free a small wool mitten red with a gray stripe along the cuff. Damp, but warm enough to hold scent. Jack felt a rush of relief as he turned the mitten in his palm. "Good work, Ranger," he said firmly, then pocketed the mitten and let the dog surge forward with renewed certainty. The shepherd barked once sharp, then pressed on toward the tree line. While Jack and his partner tracked the fragile path, Brenda Cole slammed her front door 2 streets away, breath clouding in the cold fury rising higher than fear. She had discovered Ethan's empty bed only after a phone call with Mark ended in an argument about late shifts and overdue rent. Her first reaction had not been panic for the child's safety, but dread of the questions she would face, neighbors, police, even Mark, all asking how she could lose control of a 5-year-old. She pulled her coat tight, followed the direction she thought Ethan might have gone, and cursed the storm for covering evidence. Her boots crunched across the sidewalk as she marched toward the woods, muttering that the boy needed to learn who set the rules. Back on the ridge, Jack noted the way Ranger lunged left and right, nose low, tail stiff. tracking hard along the slope where pines leaned under white weight. He radioed dispatch, recovered mitten, read with gray cuff likely child's continuing pursuit northwest. The voice crackled back, confirming EMS units were staged near Donner Trailhead. Jack glanced at the mitten again, felt its damp fibers in his pocket, and pushed on faster. The terrain grew sharper, the ground falling away in hidden dips. Ranger barked once, then yanked toward a cluster of rocks where something small lay half-buried. Jack knelt quickly, brushed snow aside, and found a wooden toy truck with one wheel missing its paint-chipped edges, dark with moisture. He held it up to his light, and for the first time that morning he felt hope and urgency collide. He remembered his own daughter at age 5, how she had carried a stuffed rabbit everywhere, and he knew exactly what it meant to hold a child's most treasured thing. He tucked the truck carefully into his jacket and urged Ranger onward. Far below, Brenda reached the line of fences where the tracks had first been spotted. She crouched, squinted, but saw only swirls of snow. She kicked the drifts angrily, then spotted faint depressions leading toward the ridge. She followed her breath, ragged her hands bare against the cold. She did not call Ethan's name, did not plead. Instead, she muttered that he had embarrassed her, and that he needed to understand who carried authority. Each step she took pressed deeper, not from love but from the determination to pull him back under her control. Jack, unaware of Brenda's pursuit, pressed higher through the timber. Ranger's nose pulled straight as an arrow toward the incline. Jack's flashlight beam caught the scatter of snow sliding off the slope, and he realized Ethan was walking dangerously close to the ridge edge. He adjusted his grip on the leash, slowed his pace to watch each footing, and urged Ranger gently. The dog growled low in his throat, not in anger, but in urgency, pressing forward with the instinct of one who knew time was slipping. Jack radioed again. Unit 7, continuing Northchild, is heading toward unstable ground, urgency high. The storm rose into a howl, whipping branches, bending the tallest trees. Ranger pressed harder. His amber eyes fixed his chest, heaving in steady rhythm. Jack followed, heart pounding every step, echoing the thought that they were close, that each minute mattered. Behind them, Brenda stumbled over a root, cursed under her breath, and dragged herself upright, her cheeks red with wind, her breath broken. She tightened her coat and pushed harder, eyes narrow with anger. She wanted to reach Ethan before anyone else could, because to her rescue meant losing her grip, losing the image she guarded. Ahead, the ridge narrowed into a path scarcely wider than Jack's boots. He crouched low, let Ranger lead, and prayed silently that the boy was still moving, still strong enough to hold on. Ranger barked once more, the sound carried off by the storm, but sharp in Jack's ears. The trail was alive, and it was pulling them toward the moment that would decide everything. The storm eased for the brief moment as Officer Jack Miller and Ranger pushed through the cedar grove, and in that stillness, Jack caught sight of a small figure hunched at the base of a tree, half hidden by snow-laden branches. Ethan sat with his knees drawn to his chest, the star pinned crookedly to his jacket, his lips trembling with cold. His hands clutched the broken-wheeled truck, the wood damp from the snow, and his eyes lifted wide when the beam of Jack's flashlight swept across him. The boy flinched and pressed himself tighter against the trunk, as if the light itself were danger. Jack stopped at once, crouched low, and softened his voice to something steady. "It's okay, buddy," he said, careful not to step closer too fast. "We're here to help you." Ethan shook his head quickly, his breath shallow, his gaze darting from Jack's badge to the leash in his hand. Jack felt the moment tighten and shifted slightly to let Ranger move forward first. The shepherd lowered his body until his chest brushed the snowtail. Low ears gentle, and he crept toward the child in slow, respectful steps. The dog's warm breath fogged the air, carrying a steady rhythm against the cold. Ethan's small hand trembled as it lifted from the truck, hovering uncertainly before pressing against Ranger's thick fur. The instant he felt the heat and solidity beneath his mitten, his eyes softened and his shoulders uncurled a fraction. Ranger leaned into him carefully, offering weight, not demand. Jack exhaled relief and kept his voice calm. "That's my partner, Ranger. He's here for you." The boy's lips parted as if to speak, but instead a sob escaped, fragile and short. He clung to the dog's neck, burying his face in fur that smelled faintly of snow and pine, and Jack saw the first thread of trust forming. Jack reached, slowly draped a thermal blanket from his pack across Ethan's shoulders, and tucked it under his chin. "You're safe now," he said, then clicked his radio. "Unit 7 child located alive, hypothermic signs. Request immediate EMS to Donner Ridge access." Dispatch confirmed with urgency, and Jack turned back to Ethan. "We're going to take you somewhere warm. Ranger and I will stay with you." The boy nodded faintly, but did not release the dog. Jack was about to lift Ethan when the crunch of heavy boots shattered the fragile calm. He spun flashlight cutting through the trees and saw a figure emerging from the storm. Brenda Cole stumbled into view, her coat flung open, hair whipped loose across her face, eyes sharp with desperation. "There you are," she cried, her voice jagged, carrying more possession than relief. "You come with me right now." Ethan stiffened instantly, shrinking against Ranger, his fingers digging into the dog's fur. Jack Rose stepped forward and extended one hand in a stopping gesture. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you need to step back. This child is under protective custody until EMS arrives." Brenda's chest heaved, her breath white against the dark. "That's my stepson," she snapped. "You don't get to keep him from me." She tried to push past, but Ranger growled low, a sound of warning, his body anchored protectively between the boy and the woman. Jack's voice remained firm, measured. "Ma'am, he's cold, scared, and not safe to move without medical clearance. You need to stay back." Brenda's eyes darted to Ethan, then to the truck clutched in his hands, then back to Jack. Her face twisted with frustration. "You don't understand. He belongs with us. I'll take him home myself." She reached forward, but Jack shifted cleanly, blocking her path. "No, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying steel now. "This boy is staying here until he's examined. If you continue to interfere, you'll face obstruction charges." For a long moment, the wind filled the silence, pushing snow between them. Brenda's gaze hardened, but her steps faltered under the weight of the dog's unblinking stare and Jack's steady posture. Behind Jack, Ethan pressed closer to Ranger, his small voice trembling as he whispered into the dog's neck, "Please don't let her." Jack heard it, the softest plea, and it sealed his resolve. He tightened his grip on the leash, kept his body square, and waited for backup to arrive. The storm thickened again, flakes swirling like restless ghosts. But within that narrow circle of flashlight and breath, the battle lines had drawn a child's fragile trust, a dog's unwavering guard, a policeman's duty, and a woman's desperate attempt to reclaim control. The storm did not pause its voice while Brenda faced off against Officer Jack Miller's snow whirling between them, as though the mountain itself wanted to keep them apart. Brenda took another step forward, her boots scraping against ice just beyond the cedar tree. "I said he's coming with me," she snapped, reaching toward Ethan. The boy recoiled, clutching Ranger's fur as if the dog were the only anchor left in the world. Jack held his ground, calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, step back now." His hand rose slightly, his other steady on the leash. Ranger's low growl vibrated through the frozen air, warning but restrained. Brenda, in her desperation, tried to shove past Jack, and her shoulder brushed his chest. Jack shifted sideways to block, but the sudden movement placed her weight dangerously close to the ridge edge. The snow beneath her boots crumbled, revealing slick ice over loose rock. For a split second, her eyes widened with shock as her balance gave way. Her arms flailed, and the cold wind tore a cry from her throat as she tipped toward the steep drop that led down into a jagged tumble of trees and stone. Jack lunged instinctively, his gloved hand shooting out to seize her arm, but the snow gave way beneath both of them, dragging her further. In that breathless moment, Ranger bounded forward with the power of muscle honed by years of training. The shepherd snapped his jaws onto the fabric of Brenda's coat sleeve, not her flesh, and planted his paws hard into the snow. Jack dropped to one knee, gripping Brenda's other arm, their combined weight pulling dangerously close to the edge. Snow cascaded down the slope like a river of glass, carrying small rocks into the void below. Jack braced, teeth clenched, muscles straining as Ranger held fast, his body angled low, tail rigid with effort. Finally, Brenda's boots found purchase against the ridge, and with one heave, Jack hauled her back onto solid ground. She collapsed onto her knees, gasping, her hair plastered against her cheeks, her eyes wild with both terror and disbelief. Ranger released her sleeve carefully, stepping back but keeping his gaze locked on her chest, heaving with controlled breath. Jack steadied himself, rose, and brushed snow from his jacket with deliberate calm. He spoke firmly, but without cruelty. "You almost went over. Stay where it's safe." Behind them, Ethan had witnessed every heartbeat of the scene. His small body trembled under the blanket, but not from cold alone. He had seen Brenda shout, reach, and push, but he had also seen her slip, seen her life dangle by a thread. What stunned him most was that the man who had blocked her and the dog who had growled at her had still chosen to pull her back. He blinked hard, clutching the wooden truck tighter, his mind struggling to piece together the truth. Sometimes grown-ups saved even the ones who had hurt others. Brenda sat slumped, her chest rising and falling, her earlier rage stripped into something rawer, fear, exhaustion, and the shiver of someone who had faced the edge. She looked at Jack. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Jack didn't press. He turned instead to Ethan, crouched once more. "You're okay," he reassured softly, his voice for the boy alone. "No one is going to hurt you here." Ranger padded back to Ethan's side, pressed his flank against the child, and settled protectively. Ethan buried his fingers in the thick fur, still staring at the place Brenda had nearly fallen. The wind rose again, scattering branches, pushing snow into their faces. Jack radioed calmly. "Unit 7, be advised, additional adult on scene, no injuries but situation volatile. Request immediate backup at Ridge." He clipped the handset back and glanced between Brenda and Ethan. The boy's eyes were wide, but not only with fear. Something new stirred there, a kind of astonishment that the world could bend differently than he had learned inside his house. Brenda finally whispered hoarsely, Why would you pull me back?" Jack looked at her steadily. "Because that's what we do. No one deserves to fall like that." He didn't add anything more. Duty didn't need extra words. Ethan pressed his face into Ranger's fur again, but this time his shoulders eased slightly as though the blanket around him weighed less. The ridge groaned under the storm, the snow piling heavier, but within that fragile circle stood a boy learning the difference between cruelty and responsibility. A woman shaken by the edge of death, and a policeman and his dog holding a line that would not bend. The rescue outpost at Donner Ridge glowed like a lantern against the storm when Jack Miller carried Ethan inside. The warmth struck immediately, the smell of wood smoke and strong coffee filling the small cabin. A nurse named Carla Diaz hurried forward with blankets, while paramedic Tom Harris set his bag on the cot. Ranger trotted close, his paws leaving wet marks on the floor, his amber eyes never straying from the boy. Ethan lay stiff in Jack's arms until Ranger pressed his muzzle against his hand, and only then did the boy relax enough to be placed on the cot. Carla wrapped him gently, rubbing his small hands until the color returned, while Tom checked his pulse with quiet efficiency. Brenda was escorted inside by 2 deputies, her face pale, her hair tangled, her expression caught between anger and fear. She tried to speak, but Jack held up a hand. "Not now, ma'am," he said firmly. "This child needs care." She folded her arms, muttering under her breath, but did not resist further. Ethan sat propped on pillows, the blanket tight around him, his toy truck tucked under one arm. His lips still trembled from cold, but his eyes followed Ranger's every movement as if the shepherd alone guaranteed safety. Carla crouched beside him with a mug of cocoa, coaxing, "Sip slowly, sweetheart." Ethan obeyed his small fingers, barely steady on the cup. Jack knelt on the other side, his voice soft. "You did very well out there. You're safe now." Ethan looked at him, then at Brenda across the room, and finally back at Ranger. Silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then, in a voice no louder than the wind outside, Ethan spoke words that cut through the cabin. "I just want to be loved." His eyes dropped to the truck in his lap as though ashamed of the simplicity. The room froze. Carla's hands stilled. Tom set down his stethoscope, and even Brenda flinched as though struck. Jack felt the sentence settle deep in his chest, heavier than any report he had filed. He placed a steady hand on Ranger's back and answered softly, "You deserve that. Every child does." No one spoke for a long moment. The deputies shifted uneasily, glancing at each other while Brenda turned her face away, lips tight. Carla blinked hard, swallowing emotion, and Tom scribbled quietly on his chart. Jack rose his duty clear and stepped toward the radio. His voice was calm but iron-bound. "Dispatch Unit 7. Child-located statements indicate neglect. Request immediate notification to Child Protective Services. Recommend temporary guardianship suspension pending court review." The words clicked through the static with official weight, but behind them lived the echo of a boy's plea. Dispatch confirmed, and within minutes a social services officer arrived, a middle-aged woman in a navy coat carrying a clipboard and calm authority. She spoke gently to Ethan, asked him simple questions, and noted his answers with quiet precision. When she asked if he felt safe at home, Ethan looked at Ranger before answering. "No. Only with him." The officer nodded gravely, then turned to Jack. "Protective custody is granted until the hearing. He cannot return to that household tonight." Brenda erupted, then her voice sharp, protesting that Ethan belonged with her and Mark, that outsiders had no right to interfere. The officer raised a hand, her tone firm. "Ma'am, the court will review. For now, the order is clear." Two deputies guided Brenda to a separate room for further questioning. She resisted briefly, but knew the authority standing against her was immovable. Ethan watched all of this with wide, tired eyes, his small fingers tracing circles on Ranger's fur. When Jack returned to kneel beside him, the boy whispered again, softer now. "Will I have to go back?" Jack shook his head gently. "Not tonight. The court will decide what's best, and until then you'll be with people who will keep you safe." Ethan nodded, but did not smile. He leaned against Ranger, his face pressed into the dog's neck, and finally let his eyelids droop. The fire popped in the stove. Deputies murmured in the hallway, papers shuffled, but the boy's sentence still lingered in the air like smoke that refused to fade. "I just want to be loved." It had reshaped the night, turned duty into decision, and carved a path no storm could erase. The morning after the storm, the rescue outpost stood calm under a pale sky, icicles hanging from the eaves like glass fingers. Inside the stove glowed steady deputies, shuffled paperwork, and Ethan sat curled on the cot blanket wrapped tight. He had slept in fits, waking often to check if Ranger was still beside him. Each time the dog's steady breath and gentle warmth convinced him to close his eyes again. Now daylight lit the room, but the boy remained silent, clutching the toy truck against his chest. Jack Miller spoke quietly with the social services officer near the stove. "He needs kin if possible." The woman said, her tone professional but touched with concern. "We've already contacted extended family. There's one who responded immediately." Jack nodded, glancing at Ethan, whose dark eyes watched the exchange without understanding. The door creaked then, letting in a rush of cold air and the sound of boots stomping snow. A woman stepped inside, brushing flakes from a green wool coat. She was tall, with auburn hair tied back neatly, her face tired yet lit with resolve. Her name was Sarah Morgan, Ethan's maternal aunt. She had petitioned for visitation months earlier but been refused by court orders that favored Ethan's father and Brenda. She had waited powerless until now. When her eyes found Ethan on the cot, they softened instantly. She moved closer, cautious not to startle him. "Hi, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Aunt Sarah. I came as soon as I heard." Ethan blinked, gripping the truck tighter, unsure if the vision was real. He remembered her dimly brief afternoons at the park when his mother was alive, laughter over sandwiches, a warm scarf wrapped carefully around his neck. But those visits had ended, cut off without explanation. His body stiffened with confusion. The social worker stepped forward. "Ms. Morgan, after review, you've been approved for temporary guardianship pending hearing. If you're willing, you can take him into your care today." Sarah nodded firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Her words carried the weight of months waiting for this moment. She crouched so her eyes were level with Ethan's. "Sweetheart, I know it's been hard, but you don't have to be afraid now. You can come with me." Ethan's gaze wavered between her face and the floor. He wanted to believe, but the echo of Brenda's voice and the silence of his father still clung to him. His lips parted, but no words came. He pulled the blanket tighter, shrinking back into the cot. The room fell still. Sarah's hand lowered slowly, not reaching further, just resting on her knee. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled gently. "It's okay if you're not ready," she said softly. "I'll be here." At that moment, Ranger rose from his spot and trotted forward. The shepherd pressed his broad head against Ethan's shoulder, nudging him gently toward Sarah. The boy looked at the dog in surprise, then at the woman waiting patiently. Ranger wagged his tail, once his amber eyes calm, as if saying this place was safe, this person could be trusted. Ethan's small hand lifted hesitantly, resting on the dog's neck. His other hand uncurled slightly from the truck. He whispered, "You'll come too." Ranger gave a soft huff, leaning harder into him, and Jack answered from across the room. "He'll always be around, buddy. And I'll check on you too." The boy's shoulders eased, and he looked again at Sarah. Slowly he stretched his hand toward her. Sarah reached out, taking it gently, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I've got you now," she whispered. The room felt lighter, then deputies exchanging quiet glances. Carla smiling from the corner, Tom setting down his clipboard with relief. Brenda, in another room under watch, did not see the exchange. But in the outpost's main hall, the moment marked a turning, a boy shifting from fear to tentative trust, an aunt reclaiming the child she had long fought for, and a dog sealing the bridge between them. The paperwork was signed quickly, the social worker noting custody transfer. Sarah stood with Ethan bundled in her coat, his head resting cautiously against her shoulder. Ranger followed close tail, sweeping the floor, as if escorting them into a new chapter. Outside, the sun broke through thin clouds, catching the snow in sudden brilliance, and for the first time since leaving home, Ethan did not feel the storm pressing on him. He felt warmth, fragile but real. The week that followed moved like the slow thaw of ice each day, shedding the sharpness of storm and replacing it with small, steady comforts. Ethan stayed with Sarah in her modest yellow house at the edge of town, a place where curtains let in morning light and the kitchen always smelled faintly of cinnamon. At first, the boy clung to his blanket and his wooden truck, wary of every sound, every knock at the door. He slept lightly, waking to check the corners of the room. But Sarah's voice carried patience, never raised, always steady, and she filled the house with gentle routines. Warm breakfast, quiet afternoons with books, evening walks past the pine trees. Ranger visited often with Officer Jack Miller, and each visit stitched another thread of security into Ethan's heart. One crisp Saturday morning, Jack arrived at the house with Ranger trotting at his side. Sarah opened the door, smiling as the dog bounded in tail, sweeping the floor. Ethan rushed forward, wrapping his arms around Ranger's neck, burying his face in the familiar fur. Jack knelt, pulling something from his pocket. A small circle of cardstock, cut neatly colored with bright markers, and in blocky letters it read, Junior Canine Assistant. Jack pinned it carefully to Ethan's sweater right above the crooked star that had once been his only treasure. For bravery, Jack said solemnly, for speaking the truth and for trusting your partner. Ranger barked once as if confirming the promotion. Ethan blinked, staring at the badge, and for the first time in weeks, a smile spread across his face, not a timid one, but a true spark of pride. He stood taller, touched the badge gently, and whispered, Thank you. Sarah pressed a hand to her heart, her eyes glistening. The moment was small, no parade, no crowd, but it carried more weight than any ceremony. The boy who had once whispered he only wanted love now wore a badge that told him he was not just safe, but valued. Ranger nudged him with a playful paw, and Ethan giggled, the sound filling the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. That evening, Sarah prepared a simple dinner, grilled chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, and set the table for 3. Jack joined them. His uniform jacket draped over the chair. Ranger stretched comfortably near the door like a sentinel. Ethan helped carry plates, his small hands careful but eager, and when they sat together, the warmth of family spread wider than the meal itself. Conversation was gentle, Sarah asking Ethan about the picture he had drawn that afternoon, Jack teasing that Ranger expected 2 treats for every trick, Ethan shyly describing how he wanted to build a tower with blocks taller than himself. Laughter rose soft at first, then brighter. As the meal ended, Sarah placed a small slice of apple pie in front of Ethan. He looked at it wide-eyed, whispered, Thank you, and took the first bite, slowly savoring it. Jack raised his glass of water slightly, a quiet toast. To new beginnings, he said. Sarah nodded, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching as though agreeing with the sentiment. Later, when the dishes were washed and the house had quieted, Ethan settled into the window seat with his blanket and toy truck. He pressed his badge close to his chest and looked out at the twilight settling over the pines. Ranger lay at the door, head on his paws, watching with loyal patience. Sarah sat nearby with a book, her presence a steady anchor. The boy whispered softly, more to himself than anyone else. It feels like home. The house breathed with ordinary sounds, the tick of the clock, the hum of the heater, the gentle sigh of wind outside. But within those walls lived something extraordinary. Safety, laughter, the promise of love restored. Ethan drifted to sleep on the couch, the badge still pinned to his sweater. Ranger guarding the door, Sarah's hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. For the first time in a long time, there was no storm pressing at the walls, no sharp words cutting the air. There was only warmth a table shared, and the quiet certainty that the child who once walked into the cold, searching for kindness, had finally found his way home. This story reminds us that even in the coldest storms, love can find its way back. Which moment stood out most to you? Was it Ethan's quiet plea for love, Ranger's rescue, or the gift of a new home? Leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of faith, loyalty, and healing.